Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now today I wanted to do something a little out of left field, and I'm going to tackle some wasteland wanderers, post-apocalyptic scavengers, and honestly, though I've gone for a kind of irradiated look, this would work for just about anything. As with the barbarians in the very last video, the important thing here isn't so much the choice of colours as the simplicity of the technique. So I will list the paints in the description below so that you can follow along if you would like, but this will work with pretty much any colours you choose to use. Just whatever you've got to hand, go nuts. So without any further mucking around though, let's get started. Now to begin with, I've given this fellow a spray of leather brown from Vallejo, but their primer colour is actually based off of Vallejo game colours leather brown instead of Vallejo model colours leather brown. So if you're wondering why they look quite different, that is why. The game colour leather brown is really designed to take a shade and deepen down over time. This one, we might use it, but I'll put that to the side for now, just so that you know what to expect if you do order that leather brown primer. Now there isn't really a correct answer to this. One of the things about surviving in the post-apocalyptic world is that there aren't really going to be uniforms for the most part, but brown, a mid-tone brown, it's going to work for pretty much everything. Now the first colour I'm going to apply, this is Basalt Grey. This is a Vallejo colour, and I'll add the numbers of them in the description too, so you can double check what I'm using. If you want to stick purely to CITADEL products, like that's what you've got your hands on, then Mechanicus Standard Grey is very close to this. You see it goes on very easily, which is part of the reason why I'm using this one. And Basalt Grey has a very slight bluish tint to it, which I think adds a little bit to the miniature. Now while that dries, we can look at his webbing and some of his straps. Now because I want to sort of replicate kind of a doomsday prepper look to him, I want him to have fairly militaristic colours. So I'm using here green grey. Again, another Vallejo colour. You might swap in Death Guard green for this. I'm going to paint his pouches in the same. And this covers wonderfully, which is one of the reasons why I really like this colour. One coat over your base coat. Perfect. Now that we've painted up all of the cloth sections, we're going to dry brush the whole miniature with dark sand. Now this, you really want to make sure you've got next to nothing left on your brush. We are really just looking to give a dusty finish, which will highlight some of those high points of detail on our miniature. So you see I'm leaving almost nothing behind on my sheet of paper there. So let's see what I leave on the miniature. So very lightly at first. There we go. Just picking out the edges of creases in his sleeve, along his hood. You'll see I need to pass over the same area a few times to build up that colour. But this gives us a very easy transition. That looks quite cool. You can do this over the grey as well, which might seem a little strange, putting a yellowish sort of tone on there. But once we've shaded it, you're not going to notice that difference. It's really just giving us some very quick highlighting. Now that will look a little ragged and quite strange at this stage, but as always, keep the faith, because we are going to do plenty more to this yet. I've got here, this is German grey, and this is a very dark sort of grey-black finish with just a tiny bit of blue to it. So I'm going to paint in his boots, and I'm going to paint in his gloves with this as well. Now as well as his gloves, I've also touched in the lower half of his gas mask and his knee pads. Strictly speaking, the pads are probably integral to the trousers and would be the same colour, but I think just a little bit of extra there will help sell the look. So now I've got just a straight black, and I'm going to fill in his shotgun, and I'm going to switch to a smaller brush, and I am actually going to paint in the faceplate of his mask in black too. Now some folks have really cool ways of painting face masks, but I actually quite like the black, sinister, faceless appearance. But that's up to you. You might want to do something different. I've got now that leather brown, so the Vallejo model colour. And again, these little pads on the sides would probably not have been a different colour. But just looking for some places to add a little bit of visual interest and break up some of this beige. Now in reality, the shotgun would probably have been black, or at least close enough to black it really wouldn't matter. But we aren't painting for reality, we're painting to make things visible on the tabletop. So I've got here one of my little old brushes, it's thoroughly beaten up, and a wee bit of Necron Compound. You can use any gunmetal sort of colour for this. I'm just going to lightly flick along some of the edges and pick out the detail there. Make that stand out a little bit more. I always sort of figure when it comes to miniatures, you are painting for target acquisition, as it were. So if you can make it easier for yourself or an opponent to spot what's on the table, it doesn't need to be 100% accurate. Now I've got a little bit of a colour literally called off-white, just adding a little bit of water to that. In some of these miniatures they'll have little stitches in their clothing. Let's get that on camera there. As well as the little toggles on his hoodie. I'm going to paint these in white. Again, one of those things which in reality would probably just be the same colour as the rest of the hoodie, but we do want a little more visual interest there. Now, there is one last detail before we get to shading, and that is this chest piece he's wearing. It's a little difficult to see tucked away behind his gun there. You could paint this any old colour, representing maybe it's a bit of sheet metal he's pulled off of a car or something, but I'm just using Leadbelcher here. Now it's time to mix up our shade, and for this I'm using Army Painter's stuff. I'm going to put on 1, 2, 3 drops of strong tone, and I'm going to mix that in with 2 drops of the Quickshade, mixing medium, this sort of transparent stuff. Now some folks have asked me how I feel about Vallejo's washes, whether or not they're any good. Unfortunately, I can't tell you. I've actually just never used them, so they might work perfectly well in this place. I'm just using strong tone and the medium because I know what it's going to give me. So we'll mix these together. And don't worry that it goes a little bit cloudy, because that is the mixing medium coming into the equation. And then we can start applying this all over our miniature. So take your time and really work this into all of the recesses. And you'll notice, for example, on his back here, if I smear it across him thus, that's looking pretty good. But while this is still wet, if you get any big patches that look a little too heavily shaded, you can move that around with your brush while it's still wet. So now once that's had plenty of time to dry, you're going to end up with a miniature that looks like this. And you'll see that Drybrush we did has given us plenty of highlighting, and the strong tone has brought it all back in together and given us some nice deep recess shading. You will get 1 or 2 areas, which you will still see a little bit of shine there, but don't worry, because we are going to varnish that anyhow. But before I varnish them, I'm actually going to use a little bit of Microset and Microsol, and I'm going to apply a decal I've got lurking over here. I just happen to have an old tank kit, which had some decals going spare, and I reckon you always keep these, because you never know when they're going to come in handy. Let's just pop that up on its shoulder, and this will take a little bit. I'll fuss with this off screen. Now it's still a little shiny, but now he's got a little bear on his shoulder. In particular, British and Lend-Lease decal sheets are going to be your best source of sort of shoulder patches of that size, and I think that looks pretty cool. What I've got now, this is some Kantor blue, but any dark blue and then light blue is going to work for what I've got in mind here. I'm going to paint, let's get them in the camera here, I'm going to paint an L shape on the mask here, sort of following the curvature of the top of the mask. First with dark blue, then a very thin little bit of rust grey right up into the corner there. And then finally just a tiny wee dot of white right up into the corner. There we go, and I'll do another one in the bottom side here. And the bonus being, of course, if you do make a mistake and a little too much white ends up going on there, just go back to your black and you can carefully straighten things out again. Now I've got just a little bit of Stormvermin Fur, and I'm just going to highlight in some of the leather details. So in particular up around his mask here, just to make that stand out a little bit more. Now once everything's dried and our decal has properly set, what I'm going to do is give him a quick spray of matte varnish. Now doesn't that varnish make just a world of difference? You know, that's really cool. I really like how that decal's turned out, eh? That's really... oh, I'm just into that. Now ordinarily I would skip ahead a little and I would just show you a finished miniature with his base done. But instead I'm going to show you how I do my sort of irradiated poisoned earth bases. And starting out here I've got some Stirland Mud from CITADEL, and I'm going to apply that with the little spatula doofer that they have got. Once this has had a quick coat over the top, we'll let that dry for about 20 minutes. Now it's important that you do let that dry thoroughly, because if we dry brush over the top of this and it's not dry, it's going to lift off and that'll be a disaster. I've got here some Ryza Rust. And what I'm going to do is quite generously, you see it takes a little bit to figure out how much you're leaving behind, but I'm going to go over all of the dirt, probably 2 or 3 passes with this colour. But when it reaches the point when I'm starting to leave very little behind, like if I spin him around and let's dry brush on the back of his base here, you see him leaving next to nothing. What I'm going to start doing is sort of stippling, stabbing, building up around his legs. You don't want to go overboard with this, but this is one way where you can make it look like he's been in the field for a little while. So don't go up sort of past his knees, otherwise it's going to look like he's been crawling around in that dirt. But just a couple of passes to make it look like that area is a bit lived in. Now you do want to be fairly generous with that orange. What I've got now is some Eldar Flesh, and we're going to do the same thing, but be a little less sort of generous with that. Now same trick, once you've got plenty of it off on the base and it's looking like that, get a little bit closer here, you can start doing the same thing, but just much more lightly. Adding Eldar Flesh, stippling that around his trousers and boots to make it look like there's dust gathered from the road. Now with a little bit of super glue on the bottom of one of the Wasteland tufts from the army painter, we'll just jam that on there, put a second one behind him, and then we'll just paint the rim around his base in a nice dark brown. Let's get a look at what that looks like when that's all finished. Now just before I show you the finished product for the other fella, here's one of the other guys that I've painted up using similar techniques. The main difference here being, instead of brown, I've used green. I've also used instead the trencher legs for the long greatcoat look, because I really think that looks that suits the post-apocalyptic look really well. And this fella, he's got kind of a Doom Guy vibe going on, which I quite like. But mixing and matching the parts is really simple, so if you have got a 3D printer, those STL files are available now, or you can wait for the resin versions to come out, which should not be too far away now. And there we have it, our Wasteland Wanderer from this video is complete. Now he's been a lot of fun to do, and very simple. As you can see, there's not really a lot of complex mixing and shading and what have you. We're still sticking to the basics of dry brushing and shading, and you can get some pretty passable results that way. So as always, thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all the patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including producers Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Connor, Trainboy, and Fred. Your support is invaluable, folks. So any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comments box below. My Twitter and Facebook are both linked there too. So thank you very much for your time, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.